In this video, you will learn to write equivalent ratios, to write a ratio to compare two quantities, to solve for the unknown part of equivalent ratios, and to find the unit rate. So to begin, we first must understand what is a ratio. Well, a ratio, by definition, is a comparison of two numbers. And a ratio can be expressed in three different ways. So for example, let's say we had 7 red marbles and 12 blue marbles. The ratio of red to blue marbles is going to be comparing the two numbers, the two values for red and for blue. So the ratio of red to blue marbles would be 7 to 12 because we have 7 red marbles and 12 blue marbles. So red to blue, we have 7 and 12, so it's 7 to 12. So you can write the ratio with the word 2 connecting it, so 7 to 12, or you can write it with a colon in between the two numbers, so 7 colon 12, or you can write it as a fraction, where we have 7 over 12. So all three of these are different ways to express a ratio. So the fraction is the one we're most familiar with. But you also need to know how to work with these other ways to express them. Next we have what's called equivalent ratios. So equivalent ratios are found by multiplying or dividing both terms of the ratio by the same number. So for example, if we had the ratio of 3 to 4, if you multiply both numbers by, let's say, 2, we would now have 6 and 8. So 3 to 4 is the same thing as 6 to 8. Or if we had 4 to 12, if we wanted to, we could divide both numbers by 4 to get 1 and 3. So 4 to 12 can also be expressed as 1 to 3. We can write it with a colon connecting the two numbers. So if we had 12 to 16, we could write an equivalent ratio by, let's say, dividing both numbers by 4. 12 and 16 both divided by 4 would give you 3 and 4. So 12 to 16 is the same thing as 3 to 4. Here's another example. Let's say we had 5 over 8. So with fractions, we're more familiar with rewriting these in different ways, but it's the same idea. So if we want, we could, let's say, multiply top and bottom by the number 3. If we multiply top and bottom by 3, we would get 15 on the top and 24 on the bottom. So 5/8 and 15/24 are the same ratio. They are equivalent. Now, typically speaking, we're going to want to write our ratios in simplest form. So meaning like 1 to 3 would be the simplest form, or 3 to 4, or 5 to 8, where we cannot divide by anything further. All right, so that's going to be typically what we want to do, but make sure you can write a larger expression if needed as well. Next, here's a real-life example. Let's say you're looking into colleges, and a college has 80 teachers and 3,000 students. Of the 3,000 students, 1,800 are boys and 1,200 are girls. So the question might be, what is the ratio of students to teachers? What is the student to teacher ratio? Well, make sure we put this in the correct order. Okay, students, how many students do we have? Well, we have 3,000 students. So we have 3,000. And then teachers, we have 80. So the ratio would be 3,000 to 80. And we could write this with the English word, or we can write it with a colon, or we could write it as a fraction. Fractions are more familiar to most of us, so we're going to write this as a fraction, just for that reason. You can write it either way, doesn't matter. And here, typically, we're going to want to simplify any ratio we have. We want to divide as far as we can. So here, notice we can divide the top and the bottom both by 10 because they both end in the number 0. So when you do that, we would have 300 on the top and we would have 8 on the bottom. So we have 300 over 8. Okay, then from here, we can divide further. So we can divide by 2. We can actually divide both numbers by 4 as well. If we divide 300 by 4, 300 divided by 4, if you go through that process, would give you 75. We can divide 8 by 4 to get 2. So what we have is our ratio in simplest form, 75 to 2. So you can write it as a fraction, you can write it as, like with words, 75 to 2, or with a colon, 75 colon 2. And what this means is that we have 75 students for every 2 teachers. The ratio is 75 to 2. Example 2, we are trying to find the ratio of boys to girls. So the ratio of boys to girls, we look at the numbers for each of them. So we see there are 1,800 boys, and we see that there are 1,200 girls. So the ratio is 1,800 to 1,200. We could write it with the colon, we could write it as a fraction, doesn't matter how we write it, but we typically are going to want to express this in simplest form. So we want to reduce this fraction, reduce this ratio, and we can do that first by dividing the top and the bottom both by 100, because they both end in 2 zeros. When we do that, we're going to have 18 on the top and 12 on the bottom. And then from here, notice 18 and 12 both can be divided by 6. If we divide 18 by 6, we get 3, and 12 divided by 6 is 2. And this is as far as we can take this ratio. So our ratio in simplest form would be 3 over 2, or with a colon, you can write that as 3 colon 2. So the ratio is 3 to 2, so that means we have 3 boys for every 2 girls. So that is the ratio, 3 to 2. Here is another example. What is the ratio of teachers to girls? Well, look at the number of teachers. We have 80 teachers, and we're given that there are 1,200 girls. So the ratio would be 80 to 1,200, which you can write with words, you can write with a colon, or you can write as a fraction. Fractions are maybe more familiar to you to simplify. And from here, notice that we can divide the top and the bottom both by 10. When we do that, we have 8 on the top and 120 on the bottom. And this can be taken further. The top and the bottom both actually can be divided by 8. If you didn't see that, you can maybe do it in multiple steps. You can divide by 4 first. That's pretty straightforward to see that. 8 divided by 4 is 2. 12 divided by 4 is 3. So 120 divided by 4 is 30. So we have 2 over 30, and we see here that both numbers are even, which means we can divide both by 2 to get 1 and 15. So our ratio in simplest form is 1 over 15. So you can write that as a fraction. You can write that with a colon if you want. You can write it with words. You can write that as 1 to 15. So any of these would be okay as far as how we write them. And what this means is that we have 1 teacher for every 15 girls. So that's the ratio, 1 to 15. Next is an example with sports. So here we have a volleyball example. Let's say some team has won 9 games and lost 6 games this season. What is the ratio of games won to games lost? Well, games won would be 9. To games lost, we lost 6. So the ratio is 9 to 6, or you can write that as 9 colon 6, or you can write that as a fraction where we have 9 over 6. Either way, we want to write this in simplest form, and to do that, we can divide both numbers by 3. If we divide 9 by 3, we get 3. Divide 6 by 3, we get 2. So the ratio is 3 over 2, or 3 colon 2, or we can write that as 3 to 2. All right, so any of these would be a correct way of writing that ratio. The ratio is 3 to 2. So we're still working with ratios, but what we're trying to do now in this part of the lesson is we're trying to find an unknown part of a ratio. So for example, if you're told that 5 over 2 equals 25 over x, and you're told to find the missing part of this equivalent ratio, what we can do is use the fact that if ratios are equal, then we could multiply or divide both numbers of the ratio by the same number. Right, so here for example, the 5, you're multiplying by 5 to get to 25. 5 times 5 is 25. Do the same thing on the bottom. 2 times 5, that would give you 10. So x, this number at the bottom, must equal 10. Here's another example. We have 12 over 5 equals x over 1. So looking at the denominators, notice we went from 5 to 1. So remember, you can multiply or divide both numbers of this first fraction to get an equivalent fraction. So here, we did 5 divided by 5 to get to 1. Same thing on the top. 12 divided by 5 would give you the numerator. So x, this number in the top, would be 12 divided by 5. So the question now is, what is 12 divided by 5? Well, if you do 12 divided by 5, you're going to get 2. 5 goes into 12 2 times, and there's a remainder of 2 as well. Right, and you can go through all that process if you want. Write a 2 here, 2 times 5 is 10, subtract, and the remainder is 2. We can write that remainder as a fraction. We have 2 over the 5, so our answer is 2 and 2/5. So you can write that as 2 and 2/5, or you can write that as a decimal. 2/5, you probably should have memorized at this point. That would be 0.4, so 2.4. So either way of writing is okay. Just make sure you follow the directions. If it says, write as a decimal or as a fraction. Now there are times when you will want to write a ratio as something over 1, like we have here. So there's times you're going to want to do that. And when that happens, that's what we call a unit rate. All right, so first we have what's called a rate. A rate would be a ratio comparing two different kinds of numbers. So for example, we would use maybe miles per hour. So like 100 miles within 2 hours. This is a ratio comparing two different kinds of numbers, where we have miles on the top and hours on the bottom. It could be the amount you're getting paid per hour, so like $7 an hour. Okay, the pay is the rate of pay is in dollars per hour. Okay, so it's comparing two different things. We're comparing money and time. So any example like that would be a rate when you compare two different kinds of numbers. So you have what's called a unit rate, which is a ratio that compares a quantity to 1. So for example, this 100 miles per hour, or per 2 hours, you might want to write this as a rate where you're comparing it to 1 hour. All right, so to do that, you're going to have to divide the 100 by 2. That's going to give you 50. So it's 50 miles for 1 hour. So that would be a unit rate. So we're comparing something to 1 unit of something else. Another example could be maybe, let's say you got paid $45 for 5 hours of work. So the rate is $45 for 5 hours, 45 to 5. You might want to write this as something to 1. So what are you making in 1 hour? Well, if we do 45 divided by 5, that gives you 9. So the unit rate would be $9 for 1 hour. So $9 per hour would be the unit rate. Okay, here's another example dealing with money. Here we have Timmy who made $120 in 8 hours. What is his unit rate? So here we have 120. That is the amount he made. And he made that within 8 hours. So the rate would be $120 for 8 hours. Now we want to figure out, again, how much he's making in 1 hour. This would be his unit rate. So to do that, we would have to divide 120 by 8. And by the way, the reason for that is because to get from here to here, notice we had to divide by 8. So do the same thing on the top. We divide 120 by 8. So that's another way of thinking through the logic behind that. So what is 120 divided by 8? Well, we go through that division process. We're going to get 8 going into 12 one time. 1 times 8 is 8. Subtract, we get 4. Bring down the 0 and repeat. 8 goes into 40 5 times. 5 times 8 is 40. Subtract, and we get 0. So that means 120 divided by 8 is 15. So that means he made $15 for 1 hour. So his unit rate is $15 per hour. And that concludes our lesson for today. We will see you next time.